So, I just finished reading Dungeon Crawler Carl books 1 and 2, and I'll be honest, I kinda fully expected to hate it. But here I am about to talk about my experience with this series that has been absolutely dominating the fantasy community for the past couple of years. So, unless you've been living under a rock, you probably noticed that Dungeon Crawler Carl has been exploding on BookTube and beyond. I mean, it literally feels like everyone is reading and raving about the series, and as someone who runs a channel all about fantasy literature, I mean, I couldn't help but be curious, right? I mean, over the past few years, we've seen literally a huge rise in serialized storytelling and niche subgenres like progression fantasy and LitRPG taking over the community, and this book seems to sit right at the crossroads of these two trends. So for example, The Wandering Inn. I mean, it's a wildly popular progression fantasy web novel where the author releases like 1 or 2 chapters a week, and in this progression fantasy, the characters typically grow stronger and stronger over time, but it is without the explicit video game mechanics. I mean, you don't get like stat on the screen or exact numbers. It's not like in The Wandering Inn you're watching a character gain like 5 points in stamina. It's more about that gradual narrative driven growth, or at least so I've been told. But that's where LitRPG steps in. I mean, in this subgenre, video game mechanics are a big part of the story. So things like character leveling up, earning achievements, tracking stats, and battling mobs or bosses is a huge part. And honestly, Dungeon Crawler Card has become like the face of LitRPG in recent times. Now obviously there are other big names in LitRPG like He Who Fights with Monsters, but looking from the outside, which I definitely am, it feels like Dungeon Crawler Card is where the party is at. And for good reason. I mean, this series has gained so much traction that it's literally been optioned by Seth MacFarlane for an adaptation and recently made its way into traditional publishing in the United States. And here's the crazy part. When book 7 dropped in Dungeon Crawler Card, it instantly shot to the top of the Kindle store, becoming one of the best-selling books across the entire platform. I mean, that is just madness. So, as a self-proclaimed fantasy nut and someone who loves modern fantasy, I mean, you kind of think that Dungeon Crawler Card would be right up my alley, right? But honestly, I just wasn't that interested. I mean, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know I rarely enjoy books where humor is the driving force. Now, don't get me wrong here, I mean, I love humor in context. So for example, I often use the example that I love the dark humor in Joe Abercrombie's First Law universe, but that works for me because that humor is woven into a grimdark story, and it's not the central focus, right? What I personally often struggle with are the books that aim to be absurd and humorous first and foremost. And I know this kind of makes me sound soulless, but I'm just not someone who enjoys a joke on every page. I mean, case in point here, while I absolutely respect the genius of Terry Pratchett, I never could fully immerse myself in the Discworld series. The absurdity and relentless focus on fun kept me from connecting deeply with the story. And then if you add my lukewarm experience with like the Cradle series, which is a progression fantasy, you can kinda get an understanding why I didn't see Dungeon Crawler Carl as a series that would appeal to me. I mean, everyone has told me that Dungeon Crawler Carl is an absurdist, humor-driven story with lit RPG elements. I mean, that's basically a checklist of things I assume I wouldn't enjoy. I mean, literally, if there was a book that was destined not to work for me, it seemed like Dungeon Crawler Carl would be the one. So, why did I pick it up? Am I a hate reader? No, absolutely not. I mean, the honest truth is I fell victim to FOMO. I mean, the relentless hype around this series made me feel like I was missing out, and I figured that even if I didn't enjoy the series, I could at least learn a bit more about what's trending in modern fantasy, which is surely valuable for someone that's literally running a fantasy-focused booktube channel, right? So let's talk about what I loved about Dungeon Crawler Carl first. Firstly, I must say that this is definitely one of the most unique stories I have ever read. Basically, at the very early start of the story, the Earth is destroyed, and it's not by like an alien invasion or because of a natural disaster, but because it's been turned into a twisted intergalactic reality TV show. And then the survivors are then thrown into a brutal dungeon-like game where the stakes are simple. You either survive or you die. So the story follows Carl, who is like an average guy with an, I would say, above average survival instinct, who gets caught up in this insane death game. And then he's armed with a little witty, snarky cat companion called Princess Donut. Now the story follows Carl as he has to navigate a series of increasingly dangerous levels filled with traps, monsters, and scheming competitors. Oh, and also should mention, this whole thing is broadcast for the entertainment of an alien audience. So basically, Dungeon Crawler Carl is a wild mix of of genres blending lit RPG elements like leveling up, skills and stats, which is then filled with humor and lots of absurdism. And I really have to praise Matt Damon for what he has created here, because even for someone like me, this absurd concept has this thing with drawing you in because you never really know what's going to happen next, or at the next door or the next level. Which brings me to point 2, which is Danemen's ability to introduce new elements to the story. So while I did end up finding several sections to be quite repetitive, I must say that overall, I think Danemen did a phenomenal job at keeping the story fresh. I mean, I was really surprised how the story constantly introduced totally new elements or world-building mechanics that made me want to continue reading. I mean, I must say that there were several moments where I was very close to feeling bored, but then suddenly something new happened that was able to keep me engaged and immersed again in the story. Now, I heard that as the story progresses, the plot takes even more wild turns and twists, which I think is definitely something that is needed to keep a series like this engaging throughout. Also, additionally, Princess Donut is brilliant. I mean, in my opinion, Donut is definitely one of the highlights of the story. And then I also just want to praise Danemen. I mean, he's clearly a talented author. I mean, if you're looking for a story with lots of humor, leveling up mechanics, and stuff like that, then I really think you should check out Dungeon Crawler Carl, because I think it is incredibly well executed. And also, just a side note, I do think that this series could really work as a palate cleanser. So if you're in the middle of like a lot of huge series, then maybe read a Dungeon Crawler Carl book in between the bigger series you're reading. And I do appreciate that it might be a bit crazy to call this series lighthearted, because the overall concept is incredibly dark, but really the tone of the story is fun and absurd. And then I also just have to say that probably the highest praise I can give the series is the fact that I kinda expected to give book 1 and 2 probably 1 or 2 stars, but ultimately I ended up giving both books 3 stars. So just the very fact that this series exceeded my expectations by quite a high margin is really high praise. Oh, and also the audiobooks are phenomenal. But yeah, as you probably guessed by now, this didn't end up becoming a new favorite for me. So let's talk about what didn't really work for me. First off, I want to acknowledge that I am probably not the target audience here, right? And I must say, I don't really think it's fair for me to critique too harshly the series for that. I mean, it's a bit like going to watch an Adam Sandler movie when you already know that this style of humor doesn't work for you. I mean, it wouldn't really make sense to criticize a movie for being what it set out to be. Now, I knew going into Dungeon Crawler Carl that it was packed with elements that typically do not appeal to me. I mean, absurd humor, lit RPG mechanics, and so on and so on. And yes, that turned out to be true. So I do think it's safe to say that this was never going to be a 5-star read for me, simply because of the nature of the story. But again, the fact that this story exceeded my expectations speaks volume about the quality of writing here. That said, let's break down what didn't work for me. Now, while I did praise Danemen's ability to introduce new and interesting elements to the story, the heavy focus on stats, leveling up, and progressing through each dungeon level, I mean, it started to feel repetitive. I mean, there's definitely like a clear formula to the whole story, and even with all the creativity, I must admit that it did become a bit predictable. And then speaking of stakes, I mean, this is where the story kinda lost me a bit. So on the surface, right, the stakes are incredibly high. I mean, Earth has been destroyed and everyone is fighting for survival in a brutal death game. But for me, it didn't really feel like the stakes were that high. So for example, I never really truly believed that Carl or Prince Donut were in a serious danger. I mean, this series is literally called Dungeon Crawler Carl, so it's obvious that Carl, he's never going to die, right? At least not in the first 2 books. And no, that's not a spoiler. But because of this, I found myself becoming less and less invested in the tension of the story. So this combination of humor, absurdity, repetitiveness, and a sense of plot armor made me start losing interest about halfway through book 2. But the fact that I made it this far and I still didn't hate it was shocking to me, considering my initial expectations of actually expecting to hate the story. Now, I read the first 2 books, but I wouldn't really say that you need to read the first 2 books to know if the series is for you. For me, book 1 and 2 weren't dramatically different, so if you don't enjoy the first book, I doubt you would enjoy the second one. That being said, I'm genuinely glad I read these 2 books. I mean, they've given me a greater appreciation for LitRPG as a genre, and I kind of better understand now why so many people love the series. And as someone who runs a fantasy-focused channel, those insights are incredibly valuable. But as personally to answer, will I be continuing the series? I don't think so. but I will definitely be recommending it to some of my readers. I mean, if you enjoy absurd humor, lit RPG mechanics, and a wild and unpredictable twists and turns in a story, then this might be a perfect fit for you. But if you're looking for amazing book recommendations from amazing booktubers, check out this video. Oh, you're still here and you want more? Well, the good news is that I have a Viking book club on my Patreon. If you join my Patreon, then you get access to an exclusive book club where every single month we read one book together and the book can be put forward by you. If you join tier 3 or 4, then you can put a book forward and then I randomly choose a book from the pot that we end up reading together, and throughout the month we discuss the book on the Patreon chats, and then we also have Zoom hangouts, which honestly are some of my favorite times of the month. This month we're reading this book and next month we're gonna be reading this book. Also, since I launched my Patreon, I basically spent my money back into the channel on video editing. I've had more than 40 videos professionally edited, so if you want to support what I do here and also help me upload more consistently, then I'll leave a link in the description down below.